My name is Robert Miller, and for the past 22 years, I have served as the volunteer fire chief for Pinewood County Rural Fire District. It is not a glamorous job, but it is one I have poured my heart and soul into since I was just a rookie firefighter fresh out of high school. Our district covers over 200 square miles of countryside, small farms, and scattered communities too far from the city to receive prompt emergency services. When someone calls for help out here, they are not just calling a department. They are calling me. The red Ford F-250 that sits in my driveway is not just a truck. It is a mobile command center, first response vehicle, and sometimes the difference between life and death in our community. I have personally modified it over the years, adding storage compartments for specialized equipment, emergency lighting systems, and communication gear that keeps me connected to dispatch. The truck might be showing its age with a few rust spots and faded paint, but the equipment inside is meticulously maintained and ready for action at a moment's notice. 3 months ago, my life took an unexpected turn when my father suffered a severe stroke. As his only living relative, I made the difficult decision to relocate closer to the assisted living facility where he now requires daily care. That move brought me to Oak Ridge Estates, a suburban development that promised convenient access to medical facilities while still allowing me to serve my rural district just 20 minutes away. The house itself was perfect, a single-story ranch with enough garage space for my personal vehicle and a wide driveway for the emergency truck. The neighborhood was unlike anything I was accustomed to. Perfect lawns stretched between cookie-cutter houses. Children played in fenced backyards instead of open fields. Neighbors waved polite greetings instead of stopping for lengthy conversations about rainfall and crop conditions. It was clean, convenient, and completely foreign to everything I knew before. But for my father, I would make it work. What I failed to appreciate during the purchase process was the iron grip of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association on every aspect of daily life. Within my first week, I received a welcome packet that contained 37 pages of rules, regulations, and restrictions governing everything from acceptable mailbox designs to the maximum height of garden gnomes. I skimmed through it, nodding with particular attention the sections about vehicles and parking, but found nothing specifically prohibiting emergency vehicles. The first hint of trouble came during the monthly landscaping inspection. A thin man with a clipboard and a perpetual frown stopped in front of my house, making elaborate notes while staring pointedly at my truck. Recreational vehicles must be stored in garages or off-site, he said without introducing himself. That includes boats, RVs, and non-standard trucks. This is not recreational, I explained patiently. I am the fire chief for Pinewood County. This is an emergency response vehicle that I need immediate access to when calls come in. He glanced at the truck again, taking in the emergency lights and county fire district emblem on the door. I will need to consult with the board, he said finally. In the meantime, you should review Section 12 of the HOA guidelines. 1 week later, I found the first warning letter taped to my door. Violation: unauthorized vehicle storage in driveway. Fine, $50. Remedy: remove vehicle within 48 hours. I placed the notice on my kitchen counter, certain that a simple conversation with reasonable people would resolve the misunderstanding. After all, who would impede emergency services in their own community? I would soon discover the answer to that question, and it would challenge everything I believed about community and service. The HOA office occupied a small building near the community pool, its pristine white exterior matching the carefully controlled aesthetic of Oak Ridge Estates. I arrived for the monthly board meeting in my official fire department uniform, bringing documentation explaining the purpose of my emergency vehicle and its importance to community safety. The meeting room contained a long table surrounded by 8 people who looked more like corporate executives than neighborhood representatives. At the head sat a woman in her 50s with immaculately styled blonde hair and an expression that suggested she had just detected an unpleasant odor. The board recognizes Robert Miller, new resident of 427 Oak Ridge Drive, announced the secretary, a nervous man who avoided eye contact. Mr. Miller wishes to address his vehicle violation. I stepped forward and placed my documentation on the table. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I am the fire chief for Pinewood County Rural Fire District. The truck in my driveway is an emergency response vehicle that contains life-saving equipment. I am on call 24 hours a day, and immediate access to that vehicle can mean the difference between life and death in emergency situations. The blonde woman at the head of the table, who I would later learn was Corinne Westfield, HOA president for the past 6 years, picked up my documentation between 2 manicured fingernails as if it might contaminate her. While your volunteer work is commendable, Mr. Miller, Oak Ridge Estates has clear regulations about commercial and oversized vehicles. They must be stored in garages or off-site. This is not a commercial vehicle, I explained. It is an emergency vehicle, and state law provides exemptions for emergency responders who need to maintain readiness. Our covenants were established before those laws, Corinne replied dismissively, and we have residents who paid premium prices for homes with the understanding that our streets would remain free of eyesores and work vehicles. The rules apply equally to everyone. Over the next 4 weeks, warning notices continued to appear with increasing frequency. The initial $50 fine doubled, then tripled. Each notice arrived with additional citations for failure to remedy previous violations and continued non-compliance with HOA directives. My attempts to contact the board through phone calls and emails were met with form responses referring me back to the same regulations I had already explained did not apply to emergency vehicles. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Corinne Westfield standing on my porch, holding an umbrella in one hand and a thick folder in the other. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside. "Mr. Miller, the board has been extremely patient with your situation," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "But your continued defiance has forced us to escalate this matter. Your fines now total $825, and we are preparing to place a lien on your property if payment is not received within 10 days. I gestured toward my kitchen table. "Ms. Westfield, please sit down. I would like to explain again why this vehicle cannot be stored in my garage." Reluctantly, she perched on the edge of a chair while I spread out diagrams of the truck and its equipment. I explained how the vehicle contained oxygen tanks that required ventilation, temperature-sensitive medications, and communications equipment that needed to remain powered and accessible at all times. The average emergency response time in rural areas is 15 to 20 minutes, I explained. Every minute of delay increases mortality rates by 7 to 10% in cardiac events and significantly impacts outcomes in trauma cases. If I have to open the garage, remove my personal vehicle, then back out the emergency truck, that adds critical minutes to response times. Corinne glanced at my documents with obvious disinterest. "Mr. Miller, I sympathize with your volunteer work, but it is not the responsibility of Oak Ridge Estates to accommodate your hobby." "This is not a hobby," I responded, feeling my blood pressure rising. "This is an essential emergency service that benefits thousands of people, including residents in communities adjacent to this one." "Then perhaps you should consider living in those communities instead," she replied coolly. "Our regulations exist to maintain property values and community standards. Your truck decreases curb appeal on your entire street." In a final attempt at compromise, I pulled out a sketch of my property. I could install a paved pad on the side yard, partially screened by landscaping. The truck would be less visible from the street while still allowing for rapid deployment. Karen closed her folder with a sharp snap. Side yard modifications require board approval, which would not be granted for vehicle storage. The only acceptable solution is garage storage or removal from the property. She stood and straightened her jacket. "I suggest you find a solution quickly, Mr. Miller. Our enforcement measures will continue to escalate." As she left, I remained at the table, staring at the scattered papers that documented life-saving equipment and response protocols. Outside, my truck sat in the driveway, ready to respond at a moment's notice to whoever needed help. I found myself facing an impossible choice between my sworn duty and financial ruin. That night, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how protecting lives had somehow become an act of neighborhood rebellion. The emergency call came at 4:23 a.m., jolting me from sleep with the harsh tone of my department radio. "Chief, we have a structure fire at Old Mill Road and County Line. Possible entrapment, multiple occupants." I was on my feet before dispatch finished the address, pulling on my uniform pants and boots while acknowledging the call. Within 90 seconds, I was in the truck, emergency lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as I backed out of my driveway. I noted with bitter amusement that no HOA board members were awake to document this particular violation. The fire was worse than initially reported. A 2-story farmhouse engulfed in flames, with a family of 5 trapped inside. 2 were children under the age of 10. By the time I arrived, volunteer firefighters from the nearest station were attempting to control the blaze, but the rural location meant limited water supply and challenging access. I immediately deployed specialized breathing apparatus from my truck and coordinated with the team leader to establish rescue priorities. For the next 6 hours, we fought the fire and conducted search and rescue operations. The specialized thermal imaging equipment from my truck located the youngest child hidden in a closet, overcome by smoke but still alive. The oxygen delivery system, also from my vehicle, stabilized the grandmother who suffered from severe smoke inhalation while awaiting medical transport. By early afternoon, we had saved 3 lives, though tragically lost 2 others. The house was a total loss. I drove home exhausted, covered in soot and smoke, my uniform stinking of chemical fire retardants and sweat. My eyes burned from hours of exposure to smoke, and my muscles ached from carrying victims to safety. All I wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before the incident debrief scheduled for that evening. I turned onto Oak Ridge Drive, barely registering the manicured lawns and perfect houses through my fatigue. When I reached my driveway, my tired brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The concrete pad was empty. My emergency truck was gone. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow forgotten where I parked, but that was impossible. I always parked in exactly the same spot for consistency during emergency deployments. I got out of my personal vehicle and stood in the empty space, looking around in confusion. A neighbor watering flowers nearby avoided my gaze. "They towed it this morning," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "Right after you left. They had 2 trucks and 4 men. They took about 20 minutes to hook it up." Disbelief gave way to panic as I pulled out my phone and called the county dispatch. "This is Chief Miller. I need to locate my emergency response vehicle. It appears to have been removed from my property without authorization." The dispatcher sounded confused. "Hold on, Chief. Let me check the system." After a moment of silence, she returned. "I show a vehicle registered to Pinewood County Fire District was impounded by Reliable Towing at 7:15 this morning at the request of Oak Ridge Estates HOA. The citation was for unauthorized parking and violation of community guidelines." My hands shook as I ended the call and immediately dialed Reliable Towing. The impound lot was across town, a 30-minute drive in good traffic. "Yes, we have a red Ford F-250 brought in this morning," confirmed the attendant. "You can claim it with proper ID and payment of the towing fee. That will be $375. I arrived at the impound lot still wearing my soiled uniform, the smell of smoke clinging to my clothes and skin. The attendant pointed me toward the back corner of the lot where my truck sat behind chain-link fencing. Even from a distance, I could see something was wrong. The emergency light bar on top was damaged, hanging at an angle that suggested it had been improperly secured during transport. When I reached the vehicle, my stomach dropped. The side compartment doors had been forced open during the tow, likely because the operators had not secured them properly. Equipment was scattered throughout the truck bed. The oxygen tanks had broken free of their mounts, damaging the regulator valves. The communications equipment was offline, its power connection severed. The thermal imaging camera, worth over $8,000, lay cracked on the floor of the truck. After paying the fee and completing paperwork that documented the damage, I drove the truck home slowly, acutely aware of every rattle and warning light indicating compromised systems. As I pulled into my driveway, a silver SUV stopped across the street. Karen Westfield stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Miller," she called out, walking toward me with a self-satisfied smile. "I see you have retrieved your vehicle. I trust this experience has clarified our seriousness about rule enforcement." I stepped out of the truck, still covered in soot and smelling of the tragedy I had just responded to. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Enforced our regulations," she replied, pointing to her clipboard. "As clearly stated in Section 12, Paragraph 4, unauthorized vehicles parked in driveways are subject to towing at the owner's expense. This vehicle just helped save 3 lives in a house fire," I said, opening the damaged compartment to show her the equipment inside. "Equipment that is now damaged because of improper towing. Equipment that other people in this community might need in an emergency." Karen glanced at the damaged equipment without interest. "Your work activities are not the concern of this association, Mr. Miller. Perhaps this will motivate you to find more appropriate storage arrangements." As she turned to leave, the full impact of what had happened hit me. Lives had been saved today because this truck and its equipment were immediately available when the call came in. The next emergency might affect someone in this very neighborhood. How many minutes would be lost? How many lives endangered because someone prioritized property values over public safety? I stood alone in my driveway, covered in the evidence of life and death decisions made hours earlier, and realized this conflict had moved beyond personal inconvenience into something far more serious. The next morning, I called in a replacement driver to cover my shifts and began what would become an obsessive research project. My dining room table disappeared under stacks of printed regulations, state statutes, and legal precedents. I contacted the fire department's legal counsel, a retired attorney named Michael Brennan, who had volunteered his services to our district for years. "They did what?" Michael asked incredulously when I explained the situation. "Towed an emergency vehicle during an active deployment. That is not just inappropriate, Robert. That crosses into potentially illegal territory. The HOA claims their covenants predate any exemptions for emergency vehicles." I explained, rubbing my temples against a growing headache. That is irrelevant, Michael replied firmly. State laws supersede HOA regulations. Let me send you some specific statutes you should review. I believe Section 458.3 of the State Emergency Services Code directly addresses this situation. The document he sent contained exactly what I needed. Section 458.3 stated clearly, no homeowners association, property management company, or similar entity may restrict, impede, or penalize emergency service personnel for maintaining emergency response vehicles at their primary residence when such personnel are on call or subject to emergency deployment. Further research revealed additional protections under the First Responder Protection Act, which specifically mentioned that emergency vehicles used by fire, medical, or law enforcement personnel shall be exempt from community restrictions when such vehicles are required for immediate response capabilities. I printed these documents, highlighting the relevant sections. Then I began documenting every interaction with the HOA, creating a detailed timeline of notices, communications, and the towing incident. The damaged equipment was photographed and cataloged, with repair estimates obtained from certified technicians. The total damage exceeded $11,000, not including the towing fee I had already paid. But something still bothered me about Karen's aggressive enforcement. Her personal vendetta seemed disproportionate, even for someone obsessed with community aesthetics. I needed to understand her motivation. My answer came from an unexpected source. While checking my mail the following afternoon, I met an elderly neighbor named Walter Griffin who lived 3 doors down. I saw what they did to your truck, he said, shaking his head. Not right at all, especially given what you do for the community. Thank you, I replied. It has been a challenging situation. Walter looked around cautiously before continuing. You should know this is not the first time Karen has targeted someone with emergency equipment. 2 years ago, Harold Peters lived in your house. He was a paramedic with a response SUV. She drove him out with fines and harassment, said his vehicle diminished her property values, being right across from her house. I froze. Karen lives across from me. Walter nodded. The big colonial with the white columns. She can see your driveway from her home office. But there is more to it than just the view. Her husband had a heart attack about 5 years back. The ambulance took 22 minutes to arrive because they got lost in the subdivision. He survived, but she blamed the emergency services for the delay, said they should have known the neighborhood better. This revelation changed everything. Karen's enforcement was not just about rules or property values. It was personal, a misdirected vengeance against emergency services that she believed had failed her family. I thanked Walter and returned home, adding this new information to my growing file. The next day, I invited firefighters from nearby stations to my home. Around my kitchen table sat men and women who had dedicated their lives to community service, each bringing their own experiences with regulations that impeded their duties. This is not just about my truck, I explained as I shared copies of the legal statutes. This is about protecting the emergency response system for everyone. If HOAs can prevent first responders from maintaining their vehicles at home, response times increase across entire districts. Sarah Jensen, a veteran firefighter with 20 years of experience, nodded grimly. We had a similar case in Westridge County last year. The fire marshal had to personally intervene. You should contact Marshal Davis. He takes these issues very seriously. As we developed our strategy, my neighbor Walter appeared at my door with an unexpected contribution. I have been asking around, he said, handing me a folder. These are statements from other homeowners who have been targeted by Karen for selective enforcement. The Johnson family was fined for having a disabled parking space. The Rodriguez family was cited for a temporary ramp when their son broke his leg. All documented, all signed. The pattern was clear. Karen Westfield used HOA regulations as weapons against anyone she personally disliked or who challenged her authority. I added these testimonials to my growing case file, then turned to a framed photo on my wall. It showed my firefighting team after a difficult forest fire rescue last summer. The people in that photo risked their lives regularly without question or complaint. They deserved better than to have their effectiveness compromised by arbitrary rule and personal vendettas. That night, I looked out my window toward Karen's house across the street. The lights were on in her home office, and I imagined her planning her next move against me. But for the first time since this conflict began, I felt a sense of purpose beyond my own situation. This fight was not just for my right to park a truck. It was for every first responder who needed to be ready at a moment's notice to save lives in our community. The strategic counteroffensive began with a formal complaint filed with the State Emergency Services Oversight Board. The 15-page document detailed the towing incident, damage to equipment, and included citations of all relevant laws protecting emergency responders. I attached photographs, repair estimates, and a detailed timeline of the escalating conflict with the HOA. "We take these matters extremely seriously," said Director Phillips, the board's senior administrator. "Interference with emergency equipment potentially endangers public safety. We will conduct a full investigation and may issue cease and desist orders if warranted." While the state investigation proceeded, I focused on building community awareness and support. I reserved the community center for an educational meeting about emergency response times and invited everyone in Oak Ridge Estates. The announcement emphasized that this was not about a personal dispute, but about community safety and understanding how emergency services function. The night of the meeting, I arrived early to set up visual aids and information packets. I expected perhaps 20 curious residents. Instead, I found over 100 people waiting, many of whom I had never met. Walter had spread the word effectively, bringing together not just neighbors, but also people from surrounding communities served by our fire district. "Good evening," I began, standing before the crowded room in my formal fire chief uniform. "Thank you for coming. I am here tonight not to complain about rules or regulations, but to help everyone understand how emergency response systems work and why certain protocols exist to save lives." Using maps and response time graphics, I explained how rural emergency services operate, the critical importance of rapid deployment, and how even small delays could have life-threatening consequences. I showed actual case studies from our district where immediate response had made the difference between survival and tragedy. In a cardiac arrest situation, survival rates decrease by 7 to 10% for every minute of delayed response, I explained, showing a graph of survival statistics. When we talk about emergency vehicles being ready for immediate deployment, we are literally talking about life and death decisions measured in seconds. I then addressed the elephant in the room, explaining what had happened with my truck without mentioning Karen or the HOA by name. I simply presented the facts. An emergency vehicle was towed during an active emergency response, resulting in damaged equipment that impaired future response capabilities. "I'm not asking anyone to take sides in a neighborhood dispute," I concluded. "I am asking everyone to consider what emergency response times mean to your families and loved ones. Whether you live in this community or 20 miles away, All of us depend on the same emergency systems being functional and immediate. After my presentation, residents approached with questions and concerns. Many were shocked to learn that state law already protected emergency vehicles, information the HOA had never disclosed during board meetings. Others shared stories of emergencies where rapid response had saved their loved ones. The following day, I received a call from Melissa Santos, a reporter with the county newspaper. "I heard about what happened with your emergency vehicle," she said. "Several residents contacted our newsroom. Would you be willing to discuss the situation for an article about emergency response protocols?" The resulting front page article, titled "Emergency Response at Risk: When Rules Collide with Public Safety," included photographs of the damaged equipment and interviews with emergency service professionals about response time requirements. The article carefully avoided portraying the situation as a neighborhood squabble, instead focusing on the broader implications for emergency services throughout the county. County Fire Marshal Davis arrived at my home 3 days later, clipboard in hand and official vehicle parked prominently in my driveway. He conducted a thorough inspection of the damaged equipment, taking photographs and making detailed notes. "This thermal imaging camera is completely inoperable," he noted, examining the cracked device. "And these oxygen regulators will need certified replacement before they can be safely used again. This equipment condition would not pass standard readiness inspection." His official report, copied to both the state board and the HOA, concluded that unauthorized removal and improper transport of emergency equipment has created a critical gap in emergency response capabilities, affecting approximately 2,400 residents in the primary response zone. Perhaps most damaging to the HOA's position was the discovery that Reliable Towing had violated their own protocols. State regulations required towing companies to follow special procedures when handling emergency vehicles, including notification of relevant emergency service departments and proper securing of specialized equipment. My attorney sent a formal letter to Reliable Towing outlining these violations and requesting their insurance information to cover the damage. Throughout this process, I continued responding to emergency calls, borrowing equipment from other districts, and using a department SUV for transportation. Each time I returned home from a call, covered in evidence of whatever emergency I had just handled, I made sure to park directly in my driveway. No additional towing attempts occurred, though warning notices continued to appear on my door. The community support grew increasingly visible. Anonymous neighbors began placing small red ribbons on their mailboxes, a quiet symbol of support for emergency services. Others approached me while walking my dog or checking my mail, offering encouragement or sharing their own stories of requiring emergency assistance. On a warm Saturday morning, I arrived home from an overnight shift to find Walter and 3 other neighbors standing in my driveway beside a temporary canopy. Underneath sat a table with coffee, donuts, and a banner reading, "Emergency Services Appreciation Day." "We wanted to show our support," Walter explained, handing me a coffee, "and to let certain people know that this neighborhood understands what really matters." From my peripheral vision, I could see Corinne watching from her front window across the street, arms crossed, an expression tight with displeasure. The tide was turning, not through confrontation but through education and community engagement. As I accepted the coffee and thanked my neighbors, I realized something important had shifted. This was no longer just my fight against an unreasonable HOA. This had become a community standing up for values that transcended property aesthetics and arbitrary rules. The emergency HOA hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday evening at the community center. The room was filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The board members sat at their usual table, but their typical confidence seemed diminished by the unexpected turnout and media presence. Karen sat at the center, back rigid and expression carefully neutral. This special session of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association is called to order, announced the secretary, his voice slightly shaky. The board will hear arguments regarding the vehicle violation enforcement against property owner Robert Miller of 427 Oak Ridge Drive. I approached the podium, dressed in my formal uniform, carrying a single folder containing my documentation. Behind me sat Fire Marshal Davis, the State Emergency Services Director, and Michael Brennan, the Fire Department's legal counsel. "Thank you for convening this special session," I began. "I am here to address not just my individual situation, but a critical public safety matter affecting this entire community." I presented the legal documentation first, explaining clearly how state law superseded HOA regulations regarding emergency vehicles. Section 458.3 of the State Emergency Services Code explicitly prohibits homeowners associations from restricting or penalizing emergency personnel for maintaining response vehicles at their primary residence when on call. Fire Marshal Davis spoke next, presenting his official assessment of the equipment damage and the impact on emergency readiness. His authoritative presence and official uniform seemed to make a strong impression on the board members, who listened with growing concern. The unauthorized towing of an actively deployed emergency vehicle represents a serious breach of safety protocols, Marshal Davis explained. Had there been a secondary emergency call during the period when Chief Miller's equipment was impounded, response capabilities would have been severely compromised. Then came the most powerful testimony. Elena Ramirez, a resident from a neighboring community, approached the podium with assistance from her teenage son. "6 months ago, my husband suffered a severe heart attack while working in our yard," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Chief Miller arrived with his emergency truck 8 minutes before the ambulance could reach our rural property. The equipment he carried and his immediate response saved my husband's life. The doctors confirmed that without that early intervention, James would not have survived." 2 more community members shared similar stories of emergency situations where rapid response had made critical differences. As they spoke, I noticed several board members glancing uncomfortably at Karen, whose expression had hardened into a mask of defiance. When the testimonials concluded, the State Emergency Services Director presented documentation showing that the HOA actions had potentially violated state laws governing interference with emergency services. "These violations could carry significant penalties," he noted, "including personal liability for board members who authorized actions contrary to state emergency services protections." Karen finally rose to speak, her voice tight with controlled anger. "While these testimonials are certainly moving, they do not change the fact that Oak Ridge Estates has clear regulations about vehicle parking and storage. Mr. Miller was given multiple warnings and chose to ignore them. The board acted according to our established enforcement procedures." "Was the board consulted before ordering the towing of Mr. Miller's vehicle?" asked Michael Brennan, speaking for the first time. Karen hesitated before responding. "As president, I have executive authority to enforce previously approved board policies." "So the board did not specifically approve the towing action," Michael pressed. "I did not require additional approval for standard enforcement procedures," Karen replied defensively. At this point, another board member, an elderly man named Thomas Franklin, removed his glasses and looked directly at Karen. "You never mentioned this was an emergency vehicle used by the fire chief. You described it as an oversized personal truck violating our aesthetic standards." "The nature of the vehicle is irrelevant to the violation," Karen insisted. "It is completely relevant," Thomas countered, his voice gaining strength. "Especially in light of state laws we have just learned about. You endangered all of us by emptying emergency services without full board knowledge or approval." Other board members began to distance themselves, both literally and figuratively, from Karen's position. One by one, they asked questions revealing they had not been fully informed about the nature of the vehicle or the existence of state laws protecting emergency responders. The mood in the room had shifted dramatically. What began as my defense had transformed into an accountability session for Karen's unauthorized actions. As the evidence mounted showing her selective enforcement and failure to disclose critical information to the board, her composure began to crack. "This is about maintaining standards," she insisted, her voice rising. "If we make exceptions for one resident, where does it end? Property values depend on consistent enforcement. And human lives depend on emergency services," I responded quietly. "Which takes precedence in your community?" The room fell silent, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. I stood at the podium not as an individual homeowner fighting a citation, but as a representative of emergency responders everywhere who balance official duties with community living. In that moment, the true heart of the conflict was exposed for everyone to see, and the choice before the HOA board became unavoidably clear. The board's deliberation lasted less than 30 minutes. When they returned, Thomas Franklin, not Karen, stood to announce their decision. "The Board of Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association hereby rescinds all fines and penalties issued to Robert Miller regarding his emergency response vehicle," he stated firmly. "We acknowledge that state law provides specific exemptions for emergency vehicles maintained by certified first responders, and that our enforcement actions were inappropriate." He continued with a formal apology, acknowledging that the towing of an emergency vehicle during an active deployment represented a serious error in judgment that potentially endangered public safety. The HOA would cover all costs for equipment repair and replacement, totaling just over $11,000, plus reimbursement of the towing fee I had paid. Most significantly, the board announced the formation of a special committee to revise HOA regulations to explicitly incorporate state protections for emergency service personnel and vehicles. "We will ensure that our community standards align with public safety needs and legal requirements," Thomas promised. Following the meeting, a separate vote was held regarding Karen's position as HOA president. The result was decisive. She was removed from the board entirely, her selective enforcement and unauthorized actions deemed a violation of her fiduciary responsibilities to the community. The transformation in community attitude was remarkable. Within weeks, neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now stopped to chat about emergency preparedness and response protocols. Several residents organized a fundraiser that exceeded expectations, raising enough money to not only repair my damaged equipment but purchase additional life-saving devices for our district. 3 months after the confrontation, I returned home from an overnight shift to find a crowd gathered in my driveway. Thomas Franklin, now the interim HOA president, stood beside Walter and several other neighbors. Behind them stood a carpenter placing the finishing touches on a custom-built covered parking area extending from the side of my garage. "The board approved your side yard modification request," Thomas said with a smile. "We thought this might help protect your equipment from the elements while keeping it accessible for rapid deployment." The structure was perfect, providing covered protection while leaving the truck accessible for immediate response. Solar-powered lighting illuminated the area at night, and the design complemented my home's architecture perfectly. But most touching was the small plaque attached to the support post, dedicated to those who serve our community in times of need. The final step in healing came 1 week later when I received a hand-delivered envelope containing a modified HOA agreement with a special addendum, specifically acknowledging emergency vehicle exemptions. This document would serve as a template for other homeowners associations throughout the county, potentially helping other first responders avoid similar conflicts. As I parked my fully restored emergency truck under its new protective covering that evening, I noticed something unexpected in the front yard. A simple hand-painted sign had been placed near my mailbox reading simply, "Thank you for your service." Similar signs had appeared in yards throughout the neighborhood, a silent but powerful statement of community values. Standing in my driveway, I reflected on the journey from conflict to resolution. What began as a dispute over where to park a truck had transformed an entire community's understanding of emergency services and the people who provide them. Sometimes, I realized, the most important battles are not fought with sirens and flashing lights, but with patience, education, and a commitment to serving others, no matter what obstacles arise.